Greetings, this is Pastor Q, lead pastor here at Third New Hope. So overjoyed to have you worshiping with us this day. It is our prayer that wherever you are feeling the power of God encompassing you even now. And so put all distractions aside and focus in, because there is a word just for you. Be blessed. Well, I thank you all for your prayers as I do my best to deliver this word that God has placed on my heart. As it's been stated, here we are on the precipice of the season of Lent, and this is the message that the Lord has given me. And so meet me in the book of Isaiah, chapter 58. Isaiah chapter 58, and we'll read verse 11 and verse 12. The book of Isaiah, Old Testament, chapter 58, verse 11 and verse 12. And it is translated from the Hebrew to the English in the New International Version this way. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairers of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. My brothers and my sisters, be so kind, look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, the preacher's going to talk about satisfaction in seasons of sacrifice. Satisfaction in seasons of sacrifice. My fellow colleagues of the faith, how do you feel when God asks you to sacrifice? This thing of giving up, letting go of things often causes us a bit of discomfort, if not frustration, at the request of having to sacrifice. I thought it would be a poignant conversation for us to have today, because we're entering into a season of voluntary sacrifice, where we are intentionally giving up of something that we have come to rely on in order to receive from God the things that God has for us. But oftentimes we become so stingy and stuck in our ways that it becomes very difficult for us to be happy in seasons of sacrifice. Rather, we find ourselves with slouched shoulders, bowed heads, weary eyes at the mere prospect of being called to sacrifice. But I wanted to help us today to find the joy and gladness that comes in this season of sacrifice, because there is satisfaction that can be found in seasons where we sacrifice. There can be some pleasure that we can find in times when God is calling us to give up things and to let go of things. That it does not always have to be a moment of mourning and sorrow when we have to let go and give up. But if we truly understand the methodology that God provides for sacrifice, we will understand that God is really giving us an opportunity to be satisfied. But the real challenge is that some of us don't know what it means to truly sacrifice. We get it kind of wrong. We believe that sacrificing is for our own aggrandizement. We want to brag and boast about what we've given up and what we've let go in order to build up our own sense of status or self-esteem. But this is not what sacrifice is for. God calls us to sacrifice so that we might position ourselves to be people who are able to transform the lives of someone else. here I am in the text, for the prophet Isaiah is having to speak this prophecy to the children of Israel because they have gotten sacrifice misconstrued. When it came to the practice and principle of fasting, these children of Israel saw it merely as a religious obligation. They were faithful to the work of fasting out of a trendy out of loyalty to tradition, and so they found themselves stuck in the routine of fasting, but forgetting what the real function of fasting was all about. And so many of us find ourselves caught up in the routine of things, not even knowing why we're doing what we're doing. Just because somebody else did it, or you saw grandma do it, or it was passed down, but now you doing it and you don't have no clue of what you're doing it for. You just engaged in it out of religious obligation or loyalty to tradition or a trendy fad. But if we are truly to get the satisfaction that comes from sacrifice, we must clarify the real function of why God calls us to do it. And so the prophet Isaiah, he has to clarify this because he asks, is this the fast that God asks for? That you would just humble yourself and be lowly and to cover yourself in a sackcloth? Is it just about these technical things that is about the fast? He says, no, that's not the fast that I asked for. The fast that I asked for is about releasing those who are captive, is about doing well by those who have been torn down by acts of wickedness. It is to free those who have been oppressed. And so what it shows us is that the sacrifice is not only about our own personal development, but really about being a help and assistance to somebody else. And so before we head into this fasting season and start patting ourselves on the back because we done gave up bread, and patting ourselves on the back because we ain't ate no meat, or we stopped having sugar, the true test of your fast is who is being helped by what you've sacrificed. Yeah. Are you finding yourself being kinder? Are you finding yourself giving more? Are you finding opportunities by which you can be of assistance to someone else? Because if the season of sacrifice is to mean anything, it has to be beyond and above just religious obligation. Doing it just because it's the traditional thing to do. No, we must truly understand that in this call to sacrifice, God is making something of us that will not only be a benefit to our own lives, but to be a benefit to those that we are connected to. And I don't know about you, but that's been my prayer time now. I've been asking God to make me so powerful that the people who connected to me are powerful. That's what I want. I've been asking God to make my life so prosperous that those who are around me are prosperous. I've been praying that God will work in me in such a way that the strength that I have will then be duplicated in the strength of the people around me. I want my circle to elevate. Am I the only person in here who's ready for your circle to elevate, ready for the people you're connected to go to the next level? Well, say, start with me, God. Start with me. Whatever I got to give up, whatever I must sacrifice in order to make a difference in the lives of those who are connected to me is what I'll do. Now, y'all should really shout on that because y'all connected to me. Yeah, and as the Lord keep working on me, watch out what he's getting ready to do in you. I already believe it. I'm trying to hold myself still right now because he's giving me a preview of what you're going to look like 3 months from now. He's already given me a sight on how strong you're going to be 6 months from now. He already has given me a vision of where you are going. Because of being connected to one who understands how to find satisfaction in seasons of sacrifice. Because here it is, as I stated earlier, when you sacrifice to God truly and sincerely, it is not a loss. It is not a loss because God responds to spirits and God responds to a commitment to sacrifice by meeting you with supplies and subsidies. What I mean to say to you, my brothers and my sisters, is when we give up something, it only positions God to then to pour in more into us. And so, my brothers and my sisters, we ought to willingly and gladly, with joy and enthusiasm, sacrifice for God, knowing that God responds to those sacrifices by providing for us. And here it is. This is what the prophet Isaiah says. He says that if they truly understand sacrifice, if they get beyond just the religious obligation and recognize that it is meant to be a blessing to someone's life, this is what God promises us. The first thing that God promises us is that he will guide us always. Yeah, that God will guide us always. You see, my brothers and my sisters, the reason why Lenten season and this season of fasting is important is because we can find ourselves sometimes forgetting to follow God. Yeah. What ends up happening is that we get so comfortable in our own routine that we actually push God out and we begin to follow our own direction. Yeah. But in seasons of sacrifice, what it calls for us to do is to relinquish our own guidance to find ourselves being guided by God. And here's the beauty. Here's the beauty, because in seasons of sacrifice, sometimes it feels as if you're in an unfamiliar terrain. You're in a space that you haven't been before. And certain times it can raise in you a level of anxiety, a level of worry, a level of concern that you don't know where to go. You don't know where to turn. You don't know what direction to take. But here is what God promises, that when we sacrifice for him, that he will be our guide always. Yeah, somebody ought to get happy in here today that you got a guide. You got a guide always. I mentioned earlier that I had the opportunity to go to the National African American Smithsonian Museum, and while I was there, I walked in. It's a massive building with 3 stories below and 3 stories high. And when I walked in, I don't know, I guess it's because, just feeling like I knew what I was doing, I decided to guide myself around on my own. So I was like, well, somebody's told me that I should start at the bottom, right? So I went down the escalator and I was at the bottom, but there were like 3 different doors. And I was like, well, if I'm going to go through this thing, should I start at this door? I don't know which door to go in. So I was with a friend of mine, and I asked him, I said, you think we should probably go get a guide? Yeah, because they got this information booth, and at the information booth, they actually have these manuals, and on the manuals, it lays out the groundwork of the entire museum. So me on my own was about to get myself lost, not using the instrument that was already developed in order to ensure that I took the right direction to see the right things in the right order. What I'm trying to suggest to somebody in here today is that we've been trying to walk through God's museum without the guide. We've been looking at doors, wondering, do I go through that door? Is it that door? What about this door? But God has already prepared a manual that has pushed out the terrains, have laid the groundwork, and all you got to do in your season of sacrifice is to stick to the guide. If you stick to the guide, you will find yourself going through places that God has already designed for you. So this is the blessing. In our seasons of sacrifice, God promises to be our guide. So we don't have to be concerned about getting lost. We don't have to be concerned about wandering wastefully. No, if we stick to the guide, which is God's word, if we stick to the manual that God has provided us about where we're going and what we are to see and what we are to do, we'll find ourselves grabbing satisfaction even in our seasons of sacrifice. But what we need to do, though, my brothers and my sisters, is to really fight against the urge to follow our own direction. Because it just bubbles up in us, this arrogant sense that we know where we're going. And that we know so well where we're going that we don't need to follow our guide. But you don't ever want to find yourself in a season of sacrifice getting ahead of God. Yep. Because when you find yourself ahead of God, you have exited outside of your protection. And then now you mad. You mad because your life had been derailed 2 to 3 weeks after the blessing you were supposed to get because you decided not to follow the guide. Because God has a way of placing our blessings not where we are, but where we're supposed to be. And so when you taking shortcuts, when you're dipping and turning and missing the path that God has for you, you are missing out on blessings that God has already positioned on the path that he's designed for you to take. But if you leave yourself open to God's guidance in your season of sacrifice, you will find him to be a faithful guide in whom you can be satisfied. The second thing that the text tells us that God will do in our seasons of sacrifice is not only will he be our guide forever, but then the text says that he will provide for us in sun-scorched lands. Right? Now, sun-scorched lands, in numbers of different translations, as I was reading it, that word changes. In some translations, it says sun-scorched land. Some translation says drought. Some translation says a desert. And what has been described here is that sometimes God will take you to places where there is no water. Oh, yeah, there's no water. And we know that water is the essence of life. And so he'll take you in some drought-like seasons, some desert-like land, some environments where the heat is so intense that the ground is scorched. But here it is. Even in that sun-scorched desert land, God promises that he will provide for us, that he will satisfy our souls in sun-scorched lands. I was thinking about that thing and thinking about the fact that God has the ability to provide for us even in our seasons of sacrifice, that we can find ourselves satisfied by what God provides us even in a sun-scorched land. But not to move too quickly, because here's what I saw in the text. The first promise is that he will guide us. But then as he guides us, we find ourselves in sun-scorched lands. I'm saying, well, God, these directions you using, right? I thought following you would help me to avoid deserts, help me to avoid droughts, help me to avoid sun-scorched lands. But God responded to me by saying, no, the reason why I had to take you to sun-scorched lands after you followed me is that I had to prove to you that I am the one and no other who is the provider. Yeah. Because when we find ourselves in spaces of lushness and full of resources, we believe that it's our own doing. We have the easy pickings of what we want, when we want it, and where we want it. But when we're in a desert land, and there's no source of water there, what God is saying, that even there, I will be the one who supplies for you. And as I was thinking about this thing, and y'all got to forgive me, I'm a young pastor. Sometimes my illustrations go too far. And so if this is the case, give me grace. But I was thinking about this because what it suggests is not only that their souls will be satisfied, but it's in a land where that satisfaction can't come from the resources that are already there. It has to be brought in. It has to be brought in. And so what the text is tailored to teach us is that God is able to provide for us and to satisfy us in sun-scorched lands because God has God's own supply. Okay? God has God's own supply. Y'all, I ain't always been saved. And the Lord is still yet working on me. And I remember, in my days when I used to go out and socialize the way that some of y'all still socialize. And there was this concern, that the places that we was going to might run out of what we had come there for, right? I mean, y'all can fill in the blanks the way y'all need to, but the key to the story was that we would come with our own supply. Yeah, like, if you was concerned that the space and place wouldn't be able to provide what you needed for your satisfaction. Yeah, you came with your own supply. And I'm so grateful that when God takes us to drought lands and he takes us to sun-scorched places, that he does not leave us without provisions because he got his own supply. Cattle on 1,000 hills belongs to God. He has his own supply. Heaven and earth belongs to God. He has his own supply. It all belongs to God. He has his own supply. So even in drought-like lands, he's able to provide for us because he has his own stash. So somebody in here ought to know what it feels like, because you know the only reason why you surviving right now is because you living off of God's supply. The only reason why you holding on right now is because you are living off of God's supply. Is there anybody in here who is being sustained off of God's supply? Even when you are in seasons where there's a drought on your job, a drought in your romantic relationships, a drought in your household, a drought in your finances, that you still do not go without because God gives you his supply. This is why the Bible tells us that God shall supply all of our needs according to his riches and glory. That's his supply. That's God's supply. So don't you ever forget how you're making it. Don't you ever forget how you're surviving. Don't you ever forget how you're being sustained. No, it's not your supply. No, it's not your resources. No, it's not your materials. No, it is God's supply that allows you to survive. And not only survive, but he said you're going to blow up off of it. Yeah. You're going to get big off my supply. You're going to grow on my supply. But here he says in the text that he will strengthen thy frame. This is thy body builds. Other translation says he will strengthen thy bones. He'll strengthen thy body. And what it means to suggest is that sometimes, y'all know when we got on that poor people's diet, and we just had to do the best to make it by. Come on, don't be faking here. We know the syrup bread sandwiches. You know, you put a little sugar and you squeeze that thing up. You know, come on now. Come on. And when you had to make it off that survival diet, right? You know, it made sure you weren't hungry, but it didn't necessarily put you in the best position to have a strengthened body. Because sometimes you had to eat some things that weren't always healthy for you, you know, but it filled your belly, you know. And but what God says here is that what he will satisfy your soul with won't just leave you bony and skinny. No, but you will blow up off of it. That it'll add more strength to your frame. And here is the importance about having a strengthened frame. The stronger your frame, the more weight you're able to carry. Somebody's missing it in here. Yeah, God is calling you to get bigger because he got more for you to handle. Yeah, more than you can handle right now. And so in this season of sacrifice, we ought to be satisfied that God is supplying our needs. And not only that, but he's blowing us up off of it, allowing us to be strengthened by it so that we might endure more and carry more for God. And so, my brothers and my sisters, if we're going to be satisfied in seasons of sacrifice, not only must we recognize that God will supply our needs in this season, but that we can blow up off of it. Here is the final thing that I want to pull from this text if we're going to find satisfaction in our seasons of sacrifice. And the last thing is that God, in our seasons of sacrifice, he will allow us to grow even under inclement conditions. Yeah. He'll allow us to grow even under inclement conditions. You see here in the text, it is a drought, a desert land, scorched earth. But yet, he says to us that we will be like a well-watered garden. Now, I don't know if we got any botanists in here, any people who got the green thumb, but in order for a garden to be well watered, it needs to be around a water source. But how can a garden look as if it's well watered in the midst of a drought? Seems to be contradictory. The environment seems to be contradictory to the result that we're looking for. But here's the beauty. Even if it's the wrong season, God will still allow you to prosper in it. See, I don't know if I'm saying that clear enough. Because some of us have been waiting for the perfect conditions in order for us to grow. But God is saying he's going to allow you to grow even when conditions aren't perfect. He'll allow you to be productive, to produce even when it's the wrong season. And that ought to be a blessing to somebody who missed their season. Yeah, somebody who failed to follow God when they needed to and they missed the season of their growth. But guess what? The good news is that even though you missed your season, in the season you're in, God will still allow you to grow. He will allow you to be like a well-watered garden. And so I was trying to read up. You know, I don't have a green thumb, not a botanist, so I had to do my best in, my Google searches and my encyclopedia studies and the like to try to figure out how is it that something can grow in inclement weather. And the one thing that I kept seeing pop up is that it's this thing called greenhouses. And if you build a greenhouse, even in inclement environments, the greenhouse is able to control the conditions of those things that is under its covering. Yeah. And so what God is telling us in this text is that in order for make us like a well-watered garden, even in the midst of a drought, what he's going to do is he's going to build a covering over us. Yeah, where the conditions under the covering is controlled by him so that the factors that are around this greenhouse can't affect the growth that is going on in the house. And this is why it's important for you to be under a covering. This is why it's important for you not to forsake coming and assembling yourselves in the house of God, because it is under this covering that God can control the conditions that allows you to grow even when the season is inclement. So I come to help somebody today that we can find satisfaction in our seasons of sacrifice because God will guide us always. We can be satisfied in our seasons of sacrifice because God will satisfy our souls even in a sun-scorched land. We can find satisfaction in our seasons of sacrifice because God will allow us to grow even in inclement conditions. But my brothers and my sisters, this is a bonus point. I won't try to hold you too long. It's a bonus point because what the text is tailored to teach us is that when we are position ourselves in this season of sacrifice, all of this sacrificing isn't for naught. But we sacrifice so that we can rebuild the walls, so that we can repair the breach, so that we can be restorers of the streets. And so, my brothers and my sisters, we ought to be satisfied today because in our seasons of sacrifice, God is only preparing us to be rebuilders, to be repairers and restorers. And I'm wondering, while some of you didn't get more happy to know that God is making a repairer out of you, that he is making a rebuilder out of you and a restorer out of you, because I just assumed that there would be some people who needed some things to be rebuilt in their life. I just made the assumption that there ought to be 10 or 15 people who need some things to be repaired in your life. Is there anybody in here who needs some things to be restored in your life? Well, if that's you today, you ought to be satisfied that God has given us a season of sacrifice. Because if we follow God in our season of sacrifice, He will allow us to rebuild the walls of our families. If we find satisfaction in our season of sacrifice, God will allow us to restore the joy of our salvation. If we allow ourselves to be satisfied in a season of sacrifice, God will, He will allow you to repair some broken things in your life. And so is there anybody in here who is ready for this season of sacrifice? Is there anybody in here who is ready to give up some things in order to gain what it is that God has for you? Because when you give your best to God, God will give God's best to you. And so is there anybody who is ready to sacrifice? Is there anybody in here who is ready for their season of sacrifice? And so when you sacrifice, you got to make sure that you are following the directions of God. And I'm so glad that God provided us an example of one who found satisfaction in his season of sacrifice. There is one who God allows to be our motto, how we can be satisfied even when God calls us to sacrifice. I'm going to give you about a minute to fill in the blanks because I think you know who I'm talking about, who serves as our example of how to succeed even in a season of sacrifice, because he came down 40 and 2 generations. He had to sacrifice his seat of authority in order to pick up the garment of humility when he clothed himself in humanity. But that wasn't the end of his sacrifice, because although he was royalty, the Bible says that he was born in a lowly manger. He was wrapped in swaddling clothes. Even though he had the wealth of the world, he made himself of no reputation. And so he taught us how to sacrifice. And when he sacrificed, people's lives began to change. Because he sacrificed, people's lives were transformed. Is there anybody in here who knows about the one I'm talking about? Because he lived for 33 years, and for 3 of those years he walked this earth, healing the sick, raising the dead, giving sight to the blind, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, freeing the captives. But that wasn't the end. That wasn't the end of his sacrifice, because on one Friday he went up a hill called Calvary. They nailed his hands, they nailed his feet, they put a crown of thorns on his head, and he sacrificed. But he was able to find satisfaction in this sacrifice when he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And so is there anybody who knows who I'm talking about. If you know his name, why don't you call his name? If you know who I'm talking about, why don't you lift his name? Because he's worthy of the glory. But I gotta tell you the rest of the story, because he died. Yes, he died. He laid down his life for you and for me. Oh, what a sacrifice that the Lord has made. Oh, what a sacrifice that the Lord has given. Oh, what a sacrifice the Lord has provided. Are you glad that he died today? He died on one Friday, and he stayed dead all day Friday. He stayed dead all day Saturday. He stayed dead all night Saturday night. But early Sunday morning, he got up. He got up. He got up. He got up in power. All power. All power. All power. Are you glad that he got up in power? Are you glad that he gave us his power? See, yes. See, yes. 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 I'm so glad that he sacrificed for me. I'm so glad that he gave his life for me. Am I the only one? Am I the only one? If you're glad today, you ought to lift up your voice. If you're glad today, you ought to open up your mouth. If you're glad today, give God praise. Give God praise. Praise him in the morning. Praise him in the noonday. Praise him till things get better. Let everything that has breath praise him. Praise him. Give him glory. Give him honor. See, yeah. See, yeah. Anybody ready to sacrifice? Anybody ready to sacrifice? Say, I won't know that God has for me. I won't know that the Lord has planned for me. I won't know that the Lord will bless me. I won't know with my name on it. If that's you today and you want everything that the Lord has for you, then help me preach this thing by looking at your neighbor and saying, neighbor, are you ready to sacrifice? Neighbor, are you ready to sacrifice? See, yes. See, yes. 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 Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Hey, this is Pastor Quantez Presley, lead pastor here at Third New Hope, and I just want to encourage you how important it is for you to remain faithful and consistent in your giving to this ministry. There is a number of things that God has called this ministry to do, not only to support our staff, but also to be a blessing to our surrounding community and to ensure that once this pandemic ends, we have a strong and vibrant ministry that is continuing to be a light even in the midst of darkness. And that requires for you to be faithful in your giving. And so it is my prayer that you will hear the voice of God clearly and you will allow the Spirit of God to lead you in the worship of giving, to be a blessing to this ministry and a blessing to your life as a result of you sowing seeds into this good ground. And so Cash App, PayPal, Givelify, or even mailing your checks are all avenues that you can take in being a faithful and consistent giver to this ministry. And I pray God's richest blessings be upon you for your obedience in the worship of giving. You be blessed.